Gavin Williamson is right. I think the Defence Secretary has shown an assertiveness that he deserves credit for. And, in Britain, it's kind of a national pastime to bash politicians. And I've done my fair share of criticising of those in power. I'm very critical of one of his cabinet colleagues, David Gauke, Justice Secretary, who I believe has totally the wrong approach to crime and justice. As I've discussed in another video. So, I've done my share of criticizing politicians, but I believe that when they take the right positions, and I believe that when they take positions that need support, then it's up to members of the public who agree with them to say so. So here's the thing: Gavin Williamson, Defence Secretary, is one of the newer members of the cabinet. He came in, I believe it was May's last reshuffle. And the impression I get, I mean, who knows the inner workings of the corridors of power? Um, Particularly in a democracy, it's a constant theatre, it's a constant Greek drama of ins and outs, and it's always been that way. So who knows what's really going on? My impression is he's not overly popular with cabinet colleagues. And I think the reason for that is his ambitions are quite clear. He went from a pretty junior position to being Defence Secretary, which is, whilst not one of the four great offices of state, it's still a pretty senior cabinet role. He's still fairly young, I believe he's in his early 40s. And he's one of those people that I think, um, are worth watching as potential future prime ministers. But when I say Gavin Williamson's right, what I'm specifically referring to is the fact that he is being assertive about Russia and China and the threats that they pose. Um, and this week it's been specifically China. Now, during the whole Salisbury thing, and just a quick reference to that, apparently some sick pranksters have put up the Russian flag in Salisbury as it's transpired that the condition of Sergei Skripal has deteriorated, and one of the four victims of that actually passed away last year, which I hadn't even realised, Don Sturgis. And this was an act of state terrorism, I would argue, against the United Kingdom by the Russian Federation. And I still find it utterly staggering that Putin has lots of useful idiots in this country who are prepared to defend Russia's lies. Um, but Gavin Williamson, as Defence Secretary, what is his job? His job is to represent the troops, the armed forces, and to put forward proposals um, and leadership as to how we should go forward in terms of national defence, in terms of what role the armed forces play, among other things. But those are what I would consider the role of a defence secretary to be. Now, we face a range of threats in this country. Pan-Islamism is probably the number one directly violent threat with the whole Shamina Begum case. And incidentally, since I uploaded that video, I'm even more convinced that we should take a hardline approach to her. She's shown zero remorse. She made the odious comparison between the coalition bombing in Syria, which was precisely to defend Syrian civilians from ISIS brutality and Assad's brutality, with the terrorist atrocity in Manchester. So pan-Islamism is a very real threat to this country. But the thing about pan-Islamism, it's not manifested particularly from one state. Sure, there's Iran, there is other hostile Islamist states, but it's more a generic problem as opposed to a nation-state problem. And I think it's a major problem. I think it might be our biggest external threat. But I do think that we face a very real threat from the Russian and Chinese governments now. When the whole Salisbury thing was going on, Gavin Williamson made that admittedly not very strong statement of, just shut up and go away. Now, that was a bit, I think he could have made a stronger statement than that. It came across as a bit, I know I'm not questioning the hard line, but I think it could have been worded better. It's like something a stroppy teenager would say. But The principle of it was right. I personally, if I would have used much harder language than that. My criticism of Williamson was he was too soft on that occasion. But with China, his critics say it's gunboat diplomacy. And of course, there's a precedent to that. Some would say his language is reckless, talking about sending I believe the proposal was to send a fleet to the Pacific as a show of strength to China. Now, again, what we're seeing here, it's somewhat different from the Russia situation, because we still have very close trade with China. There's been no recall of ambassadors or anything like that. So, on the surface at least, relations with China are considerably better than those with Russia. But beneath the surface are some very real problems going on. Definitely things have deteriorated in the last year. And specifically regarding the Pacific situation, China has been bullying and throwing its weight around in the region for a long time, um, basically building artificial islands, hundreds of kilometers from the Chinese coast. That is encroaching on the Philippines, on Vietnam, on Taiwan, on Japan, on lots of neighboring countries. And China is coming across as the regional bully, whatever excuses they use about old maps and other vague claims to the maritime territory. But this sort of military expansionism, maritime expansionism, is only going to inflame tensions in the region. And I'm not saying that China is the only country to blame. I think there's collective responsibility, but it's irrefutable that China is escalating things with this maritime expansionism. Now, it goes well beyond that. Um, China has a long term agenda to, in my opinion, weaken the West. Sure, it relies on trade, and the Chinese are, I think, more diplomatic than the Russians. They'll praise the UK. They'll use the right language, but you just need to look at Chinese language mouthpieces like Shenhua and CGTN, not the English language versions, the Chinese language versions, and they're incredibly nationalistic. They're just as odious as RT. Um, and I do believe that there is a very real agenda going on here. There's been a long standing agenda of manipulating the overseas Chinese populations. And I don't want anyone to misunderstand my position. I'd be a hypocrite if was said we should stop any Chinese influence in the UK, because I've had friends who are Chinese nationals. I want Chinese students to come to this country. We need that. We need Chinese business. We need all the rest of it. But I've got personal connections. I've got friends, and I've invited my friends to this country. So it's not about being against the Chinese people, but we need to understand what's going on here. And there has been a long-term agenda from Beijing, like I say, to stir up overseas nationalism, and we've seen many examples of that. A friend of mine who has connections to these things has helped to I lost my trail of thought there. Yeah, right now there is an investigation going on to the real role of Confucius Institutes in this country, and I think that's a good thing, because I think there is real credible concerns about what the real purpose of Confucius, excuse me, Confucius institutes are. On the surface, they're just about building bridges between culture, but it may well be that the Communist Party is using this to promote Communist Party ideology, just like they do across the Chinese education system. And that's potentially very dangerous if they are using that to manipulate young Chinese students here and others. What I find very concerning is this Tory government, for all its claims about patriotism, and the Cameron administration done the same thing, are giving the impression that they're being subservient to Beijing. During the Cameron administration, Osborne basically put human rights to the side. And we know that because Beijing praised him, specifically praised him for not bringing it up. Or as they put it, not the British are setting a good example to foreigners to not interfere in our domestic affairs. I read that as we are being subservient. and we're towing to their line. This is not a level playing field. China is a very powerful country. It's the world's second biggest economy. It's the largest military in the world by personnel, which doesn't necessarily equate to most powerful, but it's still very significant. And, it's not a country we can take lightly, not for a second. So people need to understand what's going on here. Those who accuse Gavin Williamson of being reckless fail to see the bigger picture. Theresa May and Philip Hammond and Jeremy Hunt, in my opinion, they're being very short sighted with China because they're purely looking at trade post Brexit. Now, I get it, it's a job and we can't ignore China, but my concern is there are too many senior cabinet members who take this line that we need to be basically grovel to the Chinese. That's how I see it. And they'll never use that language. They'll never say that's what it's about. They'll talk about mutual partnership and building bridges and all the rest of it. That's diplomatic language. But the reality is, if you really dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that I believe Beijing is seeing the UK as a pushover. And we need to send out a message that we can see what they're doing in terms of promoting this sort of ideology in the Chinese diaspora. I take the view that Chinese nationals who come to this country, part of respecting the host nation is not being vocally nationalistic. And I'm tired of this attitude of, oh, it's, criticizing the Communist Party hurts the feelings of the Chinese people. How many times does the CCP demand apologies from other countries? And how many times does it give apologies? Never. Although there's plenty of ground for that. I mean, right now we should be vocally siding with our Canadian cousins and our friends in Ottawa. And because of Brexit, we seem to be putting that to the side. Um, so I have real concerns here, and I think Gavin Williamson is being assertive. Yes, it's important to use diplomatic language, but I really don't see a problem with sending out a message to Beijing. Yes, we get it, you're a powerful country, but so is Britain. And, you cannot treat us as a pushover. I think there's nothing wrong with that, sending out that message. And we need to be supporting Canada and Australia. Both countries have seen the nature of Chinese nationalism and what it's capable of. Australia has long warned of Chinese interference. I mean, for a country that loves to get very sensitive about outside critique and, oh, this is internal Chinese affairs, they're very good at stoking up the Chinese diaspora, leading to nationalist demos in other countries, which is grossly disrespectful to those host nations. So finally, you know, anyone who takes this as xenophobic could not be further from the reality of what I'm all about. I love China, I love the culture, and I have many Chinese friends. I want those connections to continue. And I know that we need trade with Beijing, but we also need to send out the message that, I mean, the Huawei situation, I do think it's legitimate that we put the spotlight on Huawei. It was set up by a PLA, senior PLA personnel member, and I think we just need to dig a bit deeper here. And I think Gavin Williamson is right to be assertive. And frankly, I don't care if it's about his leadership ambitions. Politicians are ambitious. Name me one politician that isn't. It's just politics. And if part of him being ambitious is being assertive, fine. Frankly, I think it would be one criteria for being a strong prime minister. So I don't really care if it's his way of trying to get more attention for possible future leadership. That's politics. But I think Gavin Williamson's right about this.